side of the earth, in the betterment of the land that started it all.
Buckle your seatbelt and let's invite Professor Lawal Marafa for his talk, From Hopeless to Hopeful and Everything Everywhere in Between.
Hello.
Yo.
Hi. How are you?
Great.
Good. How many people have been to Africa here? How many people? Yeah, wonderful. I can see a few, but Africa is something else. So my talk today is Africa from hopeless to hopeful, everything everywhere in between. Everything everywhere in between is actually between the two extremes. So we are looking at 0 to 1. 1 can be different, 0 can be different. To most people, Africa looks far and distant. To Africans, it's basically home, and it is sweet home. But we need to know the context in which Africa exists and in which hopes will actually be seen everywhere. Africa has been a bastion of hope, and we are basically seeing now that there are many things that we can be able to look at. So increasingly, we are basically seeing full hope, and that's what we are looking at. But we need to understand Africa, the Africa that we know and the Africa that we know not. And when we talk about Africa, we are basically looking at an extreme on one side, where poverty, corruption, ingenuity, and all others are basically displayed. But there is another extreme that a lot of us basically did not know, and we may not basically be able to know. Africa is the only continent that sends out over $190 billion out of the continent to various destinations. And that is not by trade. That is not basically by some sort of payment. That is some sort of agreement that has endowed Africa to basically send that out. So we spend a lot of time talking about it, but we basically need to know how to act. And I think we have ideas that we can be able to share. And that is the benefit of a TED Talk, because TED is basically about ideas. So there can be lots of ideas, but some of them have to be logical, some of them have to be doable, some of them have also to be, to some extent, achievable. So not so much of an academic narrative, but essentially to inspire you, to let you know that there is also some sort of African situation that is basically, identifiable for everybody. So hope and hopeless, in between the two extremes, you have everything and you basically have everywhere. A few years ago, we're talking about 20 years, and probably beyond, the popular media, and that is, Time Magazine, if you like, Economist, if you like, and a bit others, started talking about Africa as basically the agony of Africa, the wars of Africa, the hopelessness of the continent. However, by 2011, they identified Africa as rising. They basically thought that it's time for Africa. And by 2013, they realized that this is a hopeful continent. And that is basically true, because it's a land of mystery. The introducers, the MCs basically identified mystery, but we also have things that people have to know. There is a lot of wealth that has been there long time ago. In fact, Mansa Musa, if you ever know Mansa Musa, it's been chronicled in South China Post very recently. Mansa Musa has been identified as the richest human being that has actually been. That was an article from South China Morning Post identifying Mansa Musa to have had money, if you like. I use the word money, that basically eclipsed Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and all others, at his time. If he is there now, basically the money that he has will eclipse, all others. Mansa Musa was basically trading with gold. He was from Mali and Ghana, around that area. This is where almost 30% of the world's gold comes from. But he was not selling. He was basically being a philanthropist, sharing it wherever he goes. So with that, Africa has a lot of mineral resources. I will not be giving individual statistics, but it is important to note that Africa basically has over 50% of global natural resources, and that is diamond, gold, platinum, and so on, and so forth. Platinum, for example, if you have a platinum country, credit card, then you know that some little bit of Africa is basically in you. I just want to concentrate on coltan. Coltan actually is one of those rare minerals. 58 to 62% of coltan is found on the African continent. So my friends, if you are having any smartphone on you in your pocket, you are carrying a piece of Africa in your pocket. Because coltan is solely used for smartphones. It's used for current television sets. It's used for medical equipment. It's actually used for Teslas and any other electric vehicle that moves on. Sadly, it's actually mined only by hand, and that is why it's coming from that perspective. So in terms of natural resources, we have quite a few. Just yesterday and today, a meeting is going on in France, in Paris, talking about money, climate change, and so on, thinking about decarbonization. But the question is, what will Africa decarbonize? Africa is the continent that generates less than 2% in terms of global emissions for climate change. So if everybody decarbonizes, you tell me, what will Africa essentially decarbonize? But we are in the bandwagon because we are still at the forefront of fighting climate change. But I single out decarbonization because I thought some discussion basically has to move on. So it has to be an issue that probably we will be able to think about and see if there is any chance of action. So Africa has defied all logic despite its riches in terms of natural resources. It doesn't work. But in any case, we have quite a few of issues that I will be able to talk about. So it's not basically only about mineral resources, it's not about natural resources, but it's also about people. We are looking at a continent with more than 1.2 billion people. More than half of that population will be below the age of 45 by the year 2050. And this educated middle class that is basically growing. So that is basically a place to target. We have consumption that is basically going on. I would only want to single out a little bit of that, and that is in the creative industry. So the creative industry now is essentially also being dominated by the African continent. I take the movies as an example. We have a movie, for example, from a movie industry, from Nigeria that is basically identified as Nollywood. And most of you will know Bollywood, of course, Hollywood, and so on. In terms of numbers of production, Nollywood is basically number one. You find it out yourself. Bollywood is number two, and Hollywood is basically number three. There are others now coming as Lollywood, and so on. But the most important ones are basically Nollywood. If you have a population that is below 50 in the next few years, then that is basically where to start. So with all this, with the mineral resources, with the people, energetic in numbers, moving on, this is the time that we think we should be celebrating Africa, identifying the hope that is in the future, looking at it in terms of balance and equilibrium. So I will probably highlight also that in movies and creative industry, I'm not sure how many of you have seen, but we have a movie that was called Out of Africa, and that also went a little bit ahead in essentially breaking boundaries. We also had another movie, from South Africa that was also, identified as Nowhere in Africa, right? So there is Nowhere in Africa that's also shot, by Hollywood, and the Ghanaians came out with a pretty much, movie that identifies the title as Somewhere in Africa. So Nowhere in Africa, Somewhere in Africa, I believe that we can be able to move in that direction and identify the critical equilibrium that we are basically looking at, and then we will be able to identify Africa as a very hopeful continent. I thank you.